In 2017, when I got an interview with a guy in prison in Mexico who's in prison for a bunch of illegal firearms, the military caught him. The military caught him because his cousin had snitched him up. He was running a little mini smuggling operation from the United States to Mexico. And he described how he used to go and he'd cross over the border, go up to Dallas area every weekend, buy about 12 to 15 guns, mostly AR-15s. Take them down to Mexico, sell them in Mexico for about $2,300 a rifle, stuff that he was buying for about $700. He was describing how he did it, and he was like, I will go up there and without any paperwork at all, buy the guns. Nothing, no ID. And he described it as a black market.
I think you highlight a topic that is ever growing more relevancy in terms of the Iron River, in terms of what's happening down south and how the U.S. is fueling it. So I guess to start off with, what was the inspiration to really jump into that? What forced you to really look at this and say, this is being underreported, people are not focusing on this issue, I need to actually put something out there that not only covers it from, a quick journal entry, a news report, but really an in-depth deep dive on where the guns are coming from, where their place of origin is, how they end up in Mexico, and how they're used. Not only Mexico and Latin America, but how they're used down there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. Great to be here. So I mean, I've been here in Mexico, came from the UK, and I've been in Mexico since 2000. Started reporting in 2001, and then found myself covering this crazy drug war, which escalated while I was here. The beginning days, I was kind of covering this crime story, some pretty exotic thing to cover. These crazy gangsters with their songs about them and living these extravagant lifestyles. They somehow managed to get away from, all the American law enforcement and Mexican military. And then I found myself, chasing this around. And as the years went on, this exploded. And covering an armed conflict or a weird hybrid armed conflict in parts of the country. Found myself covering things I couldn't have imagined. The biggest, worst atrocity I covered was in 2012, was 49 bodies that had all been decapitated, all had their hands and feet cut off, dumped on a road, arrived in the morgue, the stench of death. But also, covering these armed groups, paramilitary style groups, shootouts, could last days in some case. Things like 2,000 federal police officers, paramilitary federal police officers fighting against 500 gunmen, these kind of crazy battles happening around Mexico. Deaths just arriving at so many of these scenes, just bodies spilled out on the road, bullets sprayed all over them. Talking to victims, talking to perpetrators, getting to some of the cartel guys, in the early days, from the lower down guys, the people smuggling drugs over the border, the killers, a lot of their crazy stories. People have just committed way more murders than they can count. And then more recently, and this is carrying on this whole journey of more than 22 years now is carrying on, and more recently talking to more and more of the high level guys, of guys who are really running this thing from behind the scenes, who are now incarcerated or kind of comparing notes in some ways about what's happened this last couple of decades. It's been something absolutely insane. So within this, there was the issue of firearms. So I remember I wrote 3 books about this. The first book I wrote started really putting together in 2008. There was a moment covering this violence, and I was in the state of Sinaloa, which is kind of the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking, a bit like Sicily is to the mafia. But I was in a village in Sinaloa, and I was at there'd been 2 massacres in this village, and all of the residents of the village were leaving in a convoy like refugees. And I was like, wow. And like looking at this scene of them leaving like this is big. This is something going to destabilize the country with big effects. That was in 2008. And I was like, I can't tell this story only in, news, 4-minute news segments or like 800-word newspaper stories, even longer features for Time magazine that I did. I couldn't really get through the deepness of what was happening here. only really touching on a superficial level. So I was like, I've got to write a book about this. And that's my first book, El Narco, which was published in 2011, but trying to make sense of really what's happening here. Did a second book, Gangster Warlords. Realize this is not only Mexico, this is right across Latin America and the Caribbean, and comparing different groups, Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, Jamaica, the structures, what's really happening in terms of these organizations. And then after those two books, this is something which I've been working on for years. It was the issue of gun smuggling, of where the firearms are coming from. A hot issue in the United States, controversial issue. Now, for some time, I'd kind of thought, well, what can I really write about this? You've got a Second Amendment in the United States. People can go and buy guns. But that changed in 2017 when I got an interview with a guy in prison in Mexico who's in prison for gun trafficking. Or he's in prison for a bunch of illegal firearms. The military had caught him. The military had caught him because his cousin had snitched him up. It's kind of a classic story. But he was in there, and he was running a little mini arms smuggling operation from the United States to Mexico. And he told me his story. And he described how he used to go from, this is in the state of Chihuahua, he was in prison in Ciudad Juarez. And he'd cross over the border, go up to Dallas area every weekend, and buy about 12 to 15 guns, mostly AR-15s. Take them down to Mexico and sell them in Mexico for about $2,300 a rifle. Stuff that he was buying for about $700. You know, they'd vary what he's picking up. So you can do the maths. It tends to be, quite a significant income. He was a young guy, and so he was working in construction, but like doing that, started to make some serious income. And he was describing how he did it, and he was like, I will go up there and without any paperwork at all, buy the guns. Nothing, no ID. And he described it as a black market. The black market exists at the gun shows. You have a black market as well. So it was me and a radio producer was there. Was like, okay, let's check out his story. So we were in Juarez, drove the next day up to Dallas area to a town called Mesquite. If anyone knows that, which is also known as the gun show capital of America. So there's a gun show every weekend, but they're very big gun shows every weekend. Went in there, recording, and okay, check out, okay, well, who's selling guns with no ID? And you got some which are like gun shops which have also their stall at the gun show, and they're like, no, you need ID. And then we found some of us, okay, no ID at all. And they're like private sellers. That's how they did it. So he described it as a black market, but what is known as the private sale loophole. Sometimes people call it the gun show loophole, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's not only at gun shows, but it's idea you can have a private sale and then there's no ID used. But people were clearly abusing that. We found these people, they had a bunch of brand new AR-15s and like never been fired. We'll sell these to you. No idea at all. So this then made me think, okay, there's a lot to investigate here about what's happening with this gun trafficking. It's not simply it's the Second Amendment and you can buy guns. It's like there's rules being broken. There's abuse of these practices. So I started getting into this and getting into this. I was hesitant at first getting in such a big issue in the United States, or I don't want to, an issue that I come from outside and not want to misrepresent this issue of the Second Amendment. But God, went on a journey then of 4 years into the world of guns in the United States, but also into the gun industry, into the gun factories of AK-47s in Romania. Went to the Cujia factory, which makes AK-47s, tracing these things that end up in gun tins in Mexico through the United States. Talk to people from the head of the AR-15 owners of America, the Alaska Machine Gun Association, to the people who were very the guys in Baltimore selling guns on the streets, to try and really work out how the black market is operating. Like, what are the laws and rules of the black market in firearms? Because in the United States, you've got the legal market of 300, the legal gun owners. You've got 390 million guns in civilian hands, but also you have this parallel illegal market working, which fuels the cartels in Mexico and goes to 150 other countries, and try and figure that out. So that was really kind of the beginning of this journey.
Coming up next week on the Aftermath Daily.
There are many, many possible explanations to the Fermi paradox, and the fact that there are many possible explanations means that there is no one explanation that everybody accepts. But one explanation that I more recently started to like more and more is the following. You see, there are some futurists, Ray Kurzweil, for example, that argue that in not too long, we will reach what is called a singularity, which means artificial intelligence will basically catch up with us and become more powerful than our intelligence. Now, I don't mean by that just they will be able to make more calculations. That computers do already today. I'm talking about a different kind of machines that will actually develop consciousness. They will be more intelligent than us. They will have our type of consciousness, and they will be dominant over us.
Can you define the Iron River? Because I think that's, in terms of a concept, I think that's something that viewers need to understand, because it sounds so simplistic, but as you just highlighted, there's so many levels to it. But I think the core definition is something that everyone needs to understand in terms of what's happening, not only throughout the U.S., but what's trailing to the southern border and beyond.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, the phrase was actually used by some writers before, and I picked it up, but it was picked up a lot more after I used it in this book. And before, people spoke about iron pipeline inside the United States of guns, which would go from places like Virginia or Georgia to cities like Baltimore, Maryland, where you have different gun laws, so you have gun trafficking within inside the United States. But the Iron River is the guns being trafficked, particularly to Mexico, but also after Mexico, going on from Mexico, because you have guns traced to criminals in Colombia that have come through Mexico. And I interviewed a guy who's a pilot for the cartels who'd fly up from Colombia with cocaine and then fly back there with guns, as well as other tequila and riding saddles and other things that they might want down in Colombia they get in Mexico. So you get this chain of it happening. But the Iron River is the guns being trafficked from the United States to Mexico. So we're talking about every year estimates of more than 200,000 firearms a year. Now they're not going proportionately across the country; they're going, massively to cartels, armed groups, and you can see, cartels in these firefights with the Mexicans army, cartels with Barrett 50s firing, bam, 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 like hitting these. There's a video there where they're firing a Barrett 50 and they bang, hit a soldier, his leg blows away. This is the firepower going down, and that's a huge factor. It's become now at the same time we've got fentanyl coming north. Fentanyl is a bit of a game changer. I mean, I've been covering this for 22 years, and fentanyl's been, when I started covering this, it was 15,000 overdose deaths a year in the United States. Now it's like 107,000 a year. It's a game changer there. But we've got this interchange: guns going south, drugs coming north.
So let's get into the cartels a little bit, because I think that's also, just a few weeks ago, we had 4 Americans that were down. There's numerous different reasons why they were supposed to be down there. I've heard everything from a drug deal gone bad to they were misinterpreted as Haitian immigrants, where some of the cartels do take immigrants from deeper in Latin America and force them to essentially become sicarios. Whatever it might be, 3 of the Americans were killed, and that caused a lot of outrage back here in the US. You had senators like Lindsey Graham trying to push through to label cartel groups as a terrorist organization. And then even just a few months before that, we had El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman, who was officially arrested, obviously 2 years back or 3 years back now, where he originally was arrested and then quickly released after the town of Culiacan was set ablaze, for lack of a better word. And once again, it did happen, but it seemed like the US or the Mexican government was more prepared this time and quickly was able to get him to Mexico City. that was everywhere in the US. And I feel like it's one of the first times where people are really starting to take notice on just how powerful these groups are getting. So can you maybe highlight what's happening in the southern border? Because for a lot of people, the story stopped at El Chapo, but you've had the rise of CGNG. You've had, like you're saying, firefights happening where tens of people are dying, where police are being killed, or politicians are being killed. There's so much happening. So can you highlight what's truly happening down south right now, and how, even as fentanyl has changed the game, how much the game has also changed?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting you say that people are kind of getting aware of this stuff now. Whereas, I mean, it's because I've been kind of in the trenches covering this for years, and it's like, so when I seen this stuff in the 2000s, I was like, wow, this is crazy. This is it's nuts. And over the years, it was always like, this is, you have, very heavily armed, militias, armed groups roaming around south of the border. America's going to take notice of this stuff. So it kind of takes some time for it to really take some years for it to really come in. But it's been brewing for the last. I mean, the roots go back a long time, but really the change, it's been brewing for the last 2 decades. To give a bit, just to verify that it was 2 Americans were killed and 2 of them survived of that group in Matamoros. Yeah. It was pretty brutal, that thing there with the Americans down there. But anyway, to give a bigger picture of what's happened, I would say in a kind of bigger picture on this, bigger perspective on this over these last 2 decades, is that you used to have in Mexico, going back to the 20th century, a one-party state running Mexico. So it wasn't the Soviet Union that it wasn't totalitarian like the Soviet Union, but it was one party and a power structure running things. And you never really had law and order, a kind of rule of law working like it does in the United States, with kind of lawyers going to court and arguing these cases. It was more a kind of system of power. Power flows, down like water, and the corruption making it go kind of flows up like gas. That's kind of how I would see this, the system of power in Mexico. But the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, were the ones running this. And you kind of had a pyramid of power where you have the top was the president. They changed the president every 6 years, so it wasn't like one big dictator. It was change it, but it was kind of rigged. You knew the PRI were going to win, but they would choose who they're going to have. And then you go down and you have kind of mid-level power brokers and the governors, and then and then you have the kind of what they call caciques, which is like an old word, kind of almost meaning chief. Caciques running these parts of the country, and the drug trade happened, and it was kind of part of the system. I mean, basically they would tax it. The system would tax it. Through the corrupt politicians and police chiefs, they would get money from drug traffickers, and then they would control this. Now, when you had this change in 2000 to democratic rule, everyone's going to be happy. You got democracy, and in fact, it was a former Coca-Cola executive took power. Democracy, business, it's all going to end the history. It's all good news. When that happened, this control of the country and of organized crime broke down. And so then you got different political. Now they didn't become honest, but you got different political parties and different power, and so it became a mix of power around the thing, kind of vacuums. And so you got kind of one guy who's mayor of some town for one party, but a different guy for a different party who's governor, a different guy's president. You got federal police, you got military. Who's who within this, and at the same time, the cartels are getting more and more money. So they're getting money. They had the money from marijuana for a long time, heroin. A long time, making a lot of heroin in Mexico, become a big business. Cocaine, which began with the main money going to the Colombians, but the Mexicans took over that business of cocaine. So they ended up just buying it from the Colombians and selling it in America and making the big profits. And then more recently, crystal meth, big money, getting into the synthetic drugs, crystal meth, and then finally, end of the line, fentanyl, kind of worst of all. So there's money's pumping into these organizations, and at the same time, the kind of governmental power structure is weakening. And these organizations are getting all the guns they want from the United States and starting to really buy, huge amounts. Iron River's going into arm these guys. So these guys create paramilitary organizations. So they transform from being, you look at the old days where you had like gang members. Going to California, they used to recruit gang members in California. San Diego, gang members in San Diego go down there, guys with shaved heads, tattoos, cholos, they call them, go down there with pistols and, getting these, that ended. You had paramilitary, ex-military guys, ex-Mexican military, ex-US military, ex-Guatemalan, Colombian military, basically people, or criminals, where they would train them in military tactics, paramilitary tactics. And they armed them like militaries, organized like paramilitary squads. So you got radios, control systems, you got like bulletproof jackets, metal helmets, AK-47s, grenades. We can get into some of that, how they get, fragmentation grenades, RPG-7s, as well as the Barrett 50s and all this kind of stuff. And start organizing like paramilitary organizations. Now they're working with the politicians, and they start to kind of changes the relationship. So instead of the politicians ordering them, they start to order the politicians around. They start to tell the local mayor, you got to work for us, and if you don't, we're going to kill you, and you got to pay us 10% of your budget. So instead of like we're going to bribe you, it's like you got to pay 10% of your city budget. It's got to go to us. We run this. We run this place. And then they're getting all the drug money, but then also okay, we're going to do kidnapping. Then we'll do shakedowns. Then we're going to steal oil from, we're going to steal $1 billion worth of oil. So it's kind of real gangster capitalism, paramilitary, gangster warlords, as I call my second book, in parts of Mexico. Now, it's weird because it's not the same as say, people when they talk about it, and they talk about this in Congress and stuff now, talk about this, they're trying to make sense of what's happening. And sometimes their language is confused. They say like things like, "Oh well, a certain percentage of Mexico is controlled by cartels," but it's not the same as, say, the Islamic State controlling a territory. The Islamic State controls a territory; they got complete control, and also they care about things like educating, children. They want Islamic education. They're concerned about the culture and that kind of thing. Same when you have communist groups, the Shining Path in Peru. Take some of that. They want to change people's thinking. The cartels, first, their control is not absolute. They control certain elements. So they control the territory. They'll be happy for the government to provide electricity. They'll be happy for the government to send in school teachers. They don't care what the kids are taught in school. They want some kids. It helps if kids know how to read and write, because they want to have them working for them. They want the government to come and collect the garbage, but they want to control and monopolize violence and various rackets of making money. So you see the structures. You go into these territories and you see kids, with radios, and kids with phones controlling and the lookouts, and then you see these structures there. And that's, basically it becomes like an endemic armed conflict. Endemic kind of meaning ongoing, and it's kind of caught in its own logic. These groups are fighting each other. And fighting inside each, for control of territories, and terrorizing, journalists, journalists, politicians, putting pressure on the state, sometimes fighting elements of the state. So you've got this kind of endemic armed conflict continuing. It's driving, and it's a reason for people going to the southern border and claiming political asylum. Not every single case is valid fleeing guns, but many of these cases are. People have strong cases, and that's a whole nother issue in the United States. And you've got 1.6 million people right now on a waiting list asking for asylum, political asylum in the United States, mostly from Latin America and Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela. So that's the kind of situation. And in the case like in Matamoros, over from Brownsville, these Americans went in. Some of them had a history with drugs, but they went in supposedly for a liposuction operation. This woman, and just drove right into the middle of one of these shootouts.
And so how ingrained are these cartels with politicians, political parties, and even states? Like, obviously, the Sinaloa cartel, notorious Sinaloa, that's there. when you go to a lot of the cities, Culiacan's one of the ones like very highlighted for El Chapo. It's the people there almost defend them as if they are, not only their own, but they have, I don't even know the word for it, but they're looked at in a lot of ways as, angelic figures and in very interesting ways, in ways people I don't think would even expect. How ingrained are these cartels with politicians? Is it kind of overplayed in terms of how corrupt it actually is? Because you hear rumors that it goes all the way to the top, or is it truly that corrupt? Is there political parties, states, whatever it might be, that are quote unquote aligned with some of these cartels?
Yeah, so you kind of brought two issues. So the first issue about political corruption, it's as bad as they say. It is. Sometimes I think over my reporting over the years, I was initially naive. It's hard to gauge, because I interview these guys and I've interviewed the Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderon, Mexican presidents. I've interviewed this high-ranking head of the entire country's police force, interviewed generals and down to low, and you're with them and they look convincing. They're like, wow, maybe this guy's honest after all, they're not as bad as they say. And then you kind of see there's this court case which happened in January this year, and this ex-head of police who I'd interviewed many years ago was convicted of drug trafficking, and the stories were crazy. I mean, one of the craziest stories I think or a couple of crazy stories of his corruption, which perhaps you can call state capture or capture of elements of the state by criminal, organized crime. One of the craziest stories was this guy who described how there was the biggest ever cocaine seizure in the world in 2007. Covered this back in the day. 23 tons of cocaine. They burned it on a bonfire. Big New York Times story about it. They burned it on a bonfire. Had brass bands playing and military saluting. 23 tons of cocaine. Now worth billions of dollars on the street. This guy in the court said, no, they didn't really burn the cocaine. This guy helped us get the cocaine back. And we changed it for false cocaine. We knocked up some false cocaine. Cocaine comes in kilo bricks. So we knocked up some false cocaine. Got some flour with sugar and shit and just made this, fake cocaine. And that's what they burned. So simulation, you're not, it's a simulation of what you're seeing. It's not the reality of what you're seeing. And that's kind of narco state level stuff. Another one is, there was a police officer in the state of Michoacan, in the state police. He had the nickname Tyson, because he was kind of stocky guy with a thick neck. Used to be like friendly to local journalists, oh yeah, Tyson, come on, that's how you doing, Tyson. He was eventually arrested and came out and he gave a confession on TV. That's how they made him give confessions on TV. And he described how he was a ranking cartel member who would not only commit murders for the cartel and organize police and give police cars to the cartel and use them, he would also be involved in bloodying the recruits. So they recruit young guys into the cartel. And they want to get, you get a young 16, 17-year-old kid into the cartel. Okay, this guy's got to work for us. He's got to serve. He's got to be useful. You can't have him at a moment to be scared. So so you get these young kids to make them cut up bodies, chop up bodies and stuff of victims to get them blooded. Because you got to make them lose their sense, lose their humanity to fight in these wars. And again, that's a state police commander. So yeah, it's as bad as they say. Now I would add just a kind of footnote to that. When I say it's that bad, it's almost like, damn, this whole state's got to go. What do we do with that? If a state's that rotten, what do you do with it? Now, I don't quite see that in the weird, Mexican. If you think about the state or conceptually a state, perhaps like a forest of different trees. So you've got, areas like the military or the police, but then also you've got things like the health service. You've got the school teachers. You've got, the electricity. So parts of the state are still functioning okay and are not, involved in the narco thing, and parts of them are totally corrupt. So if you think about these different trees and then they've got like this rotten venomous plant wrapped around certain trees. Now, and it gets to the point around certain trees where it's kind of this plant is really embedded into changing nutrients with these trees, so you can't even really see where the state begins and the crime stops. It's just like one thing, and these cops, cops and criminals, they're literally the same thing. But, is it going to be any good to try and set fire to the whole forest? If you set fire to the whole forest to try and burn it down, is that going to be like, about wildfires from California? Okay. Is that going to really make things better? You set fire to the whole forest, then we end up putting it out halfway through and we still got it. Or we've got to try and, how do you try and remove that rot from certain trees, or, maybe chop down a couple of trees? So that's one thing, the state. The second thing is you mentioned was the population, the communities, the people. So I would say that's mixed, very mixed. Mexico's a big country of 130 million people. This is not all of the country. It's certain areas where the cartels are very, very strong, certain areas where they're mediumly strong, and certain areas where they're not really an issue. If you look at the areas where they're very strong, then you certainly do have a support base for the cartels, and they deliberately cultivate this. You saw during the early COVID when everything was locked down, and they went to these communities and started handing out goodie bags. I went to one of the places where people were receiving these goodie bags, plastic bags with sugar and eggs, and these people saying, and they gave us, it wasn't only cheap eggs and sugar, they gave us, it was good quality, proper, brand name sugar they were giving us. It's not even that many people who really receive it, but they'll video it, they'll put it out on the social media. So, we're the good guys. We're giving back to our communities. The same thing. You'll get that in, there's a Children's Day in Mexico that give out presents to poor kids. So again, you're winning hearts and minds. So you get that. Then also, you get the narco culture, which is a whole thing of songs. They'll pay musicians to sing songs about them. Part of that because it's a weird culture. These, when you get into it, these are pretty good. These are pretty good songs, pretty good bands. I've talked to some of these guys, and they get paid like $40,000 to write a song about some drug trafficker. They play at their party, sometimes $100,000. It's a crazy world. But so that's a way as well. They kind of really got their fingers on the culture, and that culture is very popular. And you get, some people who are paid or getting money from them who, they'll move people on the streets. It's mostly them really moving it, who take to the streets suddenly to demonstrate. And really, these are cartel organized demonstrations. They'll use the same tactics of, in Mexico, the kind of left wing activists of marching, blockading roads, burning trucks. And they'll kind of use it and pretend it's sometimes pretend it's like an anti-military demonstration, but really it's like cartel orchestrated. So they use some of these techniques as well. Now, as well as that, in the community, there's many people who hate these cartels, who have had children who've been killed by them, who've disappeared, who really don't like living. If you could imagine in the community where you grew up, and think about the kind of most violent people there, the kind of worst thugs in your community. Everyone's got one. I grew up in a small town in England, but we had a couple of local thugs, kind of hooligans, thugs who would like rob houses and start fights, and people would be scared of a couple of guys. But they haven't really got some big status in this big community. Imagine those guys are the guys running the town. Those guys are in charge. It's not all the case, because sometimes, and I've talked to some of these leaders of these cartels, and they're not only thugs, to be fair. Some of them, they're very clever as well, and they're charismatic guys, and they're guys who know how to talk, because to control people, it's kind of a political thing as well. You're how do you control people? But you've got a lot of power to like thugs, down on the streets. If you're in one of these places like Sinaloa, I had a friend there. He had like banged into a car. Or the car kind of banged into him, one of these like incidents. The guy suddenly comes out of the car, it's complete narco. So he says, "Oh, I want $5,000 right now. No, give me the money right now. I haven't got it. Let's go to your house." So suddenly he has to go to his house. He's living with his parents, and his guys going in with guns, trying to get him the money So that's what you have to live with on a daily basis, living around these. There's just thousands of incidents like that you can describe. So many people against them now. You've had, worse practices. That's the kind of lightweight things, the worst stuff, where you had cartels. They vary in how predatory they are. One of the more predatory ones was known as the Knights Templar, kind of bizarre name, taking the name from these Caballeros Templarios, this name of these crusading knights. Now, they began to say, when they rose, this is early 2010s, they really got to their zenith, maybe about 2013. But they would go to, everyone starts saying, okay, everyone's got to pay us money. You're making tortillas, you've got to pay us a money, and all of the, if you sell your tortillas for 15 pesos a kilo, you've got to pay us 2 pesos. You're having a party, are you? You've got to pay us money. So your shakedowns for everything. You're growing limes, cultivating limes, pay us some money. I thought we'll take over the lime cooperative and we'll set the prices of limes, giving us our own pay. And they started saying, oh, right, I see you've got a nice looking daughter. We're going to take her with us for a ride. She'll come back in a few days, pregnant. That's the kind of really abusive. And if you look at this one guy called Dr. Moreles, who's one of the guys who rebelled against them, with his own suspect history. But anyway, Dr. Moreles, he described this, he was a doctor, and so he was, all these girls coming in pregnant and they've been raped. That was a point. People don't like, and people are sensitive talking about this because it was not only the issue of rape, the humiliation, but that was the point. These guys so we get back to guns. They were like, we're going to take up guns against the cartel. So we're forming our own militia. So they kind of met together in secret, and then they announced up, and then they created this big militia movement known as autodefensas, self-defense squads, against the cartels, led to a big kind of trench warfare that happened over 2014 in Michoacan, still going on, really. Now, the problem for that, and one of the reasons why, again, I'll be hesitant to saying that's a solution, because I'm sure some people will hear that and go, well, guns a solution. You've got to give the good guys guns. The problem why that didn't work out is you ended up with these same self-defense squads becoming the new cartel. Suddenly they're controlling towns, disappearing people, trafficking drugs, doing the same stuff. So it's like, how do you create a police force that can really work, which is really responsive to people? These are tough things. These are tough questions. I mean, I think about guns and self-defense and living here, when you really deal with this stuff, as I go around the country and deal with heavily armed guys, I could carry a gun. It wouldn't be any good for my safety. In fact, it'd be more of a liability. Because when I'm dealing with, sometimes, like a dozen guys with AK-47s, if I have a handgun, it's no good. I don't bring security with me because it's no good bringing some unarmed security. I mean, a lot of these TV companies are like, oh, we've got to send security. It's like, these security guys aren't what are they going to do? They're already more of a liability. You have some ex-military guy to say it looks worse. If I have 12 guys with AK-47s, that's protection. And then sometimes I'll go to play. I mean, one time I was going to a place in Michoacan State, and I talked to one of these local guys who's currently in prison in Florida, but he was kind of the local chief. And I said I wanted to look at some of these mines, and he actually gave me about 15 guys. He goes, bring them. Here's 15 guys in a couple of trucks, and they can take you around and show you. I've gone to places with a local police and said, can you help give us some backup? We're going to go to this place. I went to a place. It was where they'd melted the bodies, dissolved the bodies of more than 250 people in metal barrels. A state called Coahuila. Horrific story. I went there with a colleague. We went there. They still had the metal barrels. They still had you could still see like plastic, things of car acid and, different battery acid, different stuff they'd used to make these mixtures. Went there and we asked for backup, and they sent us a whole convoy of these very heavily armed state police. I mean, the same state police are corrupt and stuff, but in that particular case, they're with us, giving us some backup to do this. So the issue again is like, me having a gun is not going to defend myself against this stuff. It's like, how do you really kind of see power, gun power, firepower in a state where you do get a state collapsing or becoming completely corrupt? And how do you see that? And I would argue that in the United States, the reason really that criminals are kept in check in the United States, I'm very open to this discussion. I'm always learning. I could be wrong about a lot of this stuff. But the reason I believe that criminals are kept in check in the United States in a big way is because the United States, it has paradoxes that it has very, very powerful law enforcement historically. It's getting weakened the last couple of years, but historically, the US has hit organized crime, gangs hard. So they haven't grown in power like they have here. And that's really what stops some gangsters with guns, kicking down your door and going and taking somebody.
So I think I follow the narco culture pretty in depth. And I think one of the things people always highlight is when the Mexican Marines are coming, that means you're pretty much fucked. Whoever it might be, whether you're a high ranking narco official or if you're a low level sicario. But I think this brings us back to, I think you're fully correct. I think having the not heavily armed, but closer to militarized police does help mitigate crime. But when we look at the perspective in Mexico, we highlight the Mexican Marines, but there's a lot of questions a lot of times too that, and this brings us back to almost the corruption conversation, is that they are the power player. They are the ones that were like, they're going to shut down the groups. However, when corruption gets involved, there's questions. I know this is pretty popularized. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit, where there was murmurs that the government took Sinaloa's side in their conflict with the Zetas. So doesn't that also kind of create that dynamic there too, where we have to look into how are we going to be able to foolproof, these type of government entities, because getting the Marines well armed and, ready to take on whatever situation might be in front of them is one thing. Getting them willing to, fully get rid of all the cartels or not side with one, as the example with Sinaloa, is a whole nother.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, absolutely. There was, huge corruption and times where the government or elements, again, the government itself now is a many-headed beast. But you had large elements of federal forces taking the side of the Sinaloa cartel against Zetas, against the Juarez cartel. So then sometimes as well, what you get is you get different elements of the state working with different cartels. In the early days, back in the 2000s, I was covering a shootout between the local city police and the federal police. But the reason is because having a shootout because they're working with different cartels. So they're fighting, you got it. And so so it's literal kind of crazy stuff there. Absolutely. Like there was elements with the Marines, which then helped up back the Jalisco cartel originally at one time. The Zetas kidnapped 6 Marines. They set them up in the state of Veracruz, and they invited them. They were working with local police, and they said, "Come out for a drink in the evening." Local police were working. No, they come out for a drink with these local cops they're working with. Didn't have all their gear with them, the guns. Walk into a bar, Zetas are there. Kidnapped them, tortured them on video, and murdered them. I mean, the Zetas were like beyond the pale. They were like, even with inside the craziness, they were like the beyond the pale crazies. So then the Marines after that were like, "Fuck these guys. We're gonna fucking kill Zetas. We ain't gonna fuck anymore. We got. Imagine having the American Marines. If you had 6 of your guys being kidnapped and murdered, or like, be like, fuck it. We're just gonna kill it. So they start going out, bang, 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 bang. We're gonna kill people wherever. Now, when you start doing that, are you necessarily killing the bad guys? Then you start like grabbing some kid. Is he really part of them? But also, even if he is part of them, I mean, this happens. It's a big incident recently. You find some of these guys, they are bad guys, but then you go in there and like bang, 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 we're killing them as well without they got the guns down. Because what are the rules of engagement in this situation? They're not clear. So then everyone's like, this becomes the story, and it's right. You can't really have the military going around just murdering people. I mean, if it was my kid and the military just kill them, and it's like, but then again, sometimes they're killing bad guys, but they're killing bad guys without, when their guns are down. Now, worse than that still. I was in the and this is sensitive stuff, but I was in the port of Manzanillo, biggest port in Mexico. Faces China, 3 million containers coming through that a year. Run by the Marines right now. Fentanyl's coming through there. Bribes are being paid. So there's a lot of money in drugs.
And we saw a video of Guzman arrested recently too, and I was surprised that he was arrested, apprehended, and how quickly they moved him to Mexico City. I remember, obviously, like I said, Culiacan was on fire once again, and they were doing everything they could to, bail him out and basically put him in the same situation they were in 2019. What do you think that was about as well? Because, like we said, there's interconnectivity within the government and these cartels, and CJNG is one a lot of people highlight as the rising power, and their brutality is something crazy, to say the least. But then also you still have people in the background like Omar Zambada. There's a lot of power players. So what do you think happened there?
Yeah, so when we talk again about this power, and a lot of this, I guess, it's very interesting. We talk about this now. It's kind of understanding is a kind of power conflict, really, to make sense of this in the basic sense. So the cartels, you get like this, the state is more powerful in the 20th century. It's corrupt, but it's more powerful. The state becomes weakened, and the cartels rise and become a power that clearly threatens the state in terms of power. But the state is corrupt, and so you've got rotten elements of the state, and the cartels work with them. If we look at 2019, the first attempt to arrest Ovidio Guzman. So 2019, they go in there. They have about 100 soldiers and police going for this takedown of Ovidio Guzman. They go in to take him out. They set up perimeters around the building, and the gunmen react very, very fast and immediately are engaged. So they're trying to set up a perimeter around the house where they're arresting him, and the gunmen are engaging and fighting with them around the perimeter. It escalates, and very quickly, this shows how these cartels, you can't help but admire how incredible they are as organizations and what they can do with this stuff. They get more than 700 gunmen to the streets within a couple of hours. Onto the streets, fighting. I mean, any guerrilla group in the world, any insurgent group would be pretty envious of that. I mean, bang, and these guys, this is happening, bang, the way you look at the way they organize, they have different crews, different guys. Like I'm in charge of 6 guys with my particular vehicle. I get my guys, and I've got a guy above me, and bang, and brum, and they're like got these guys on the streets. The military get like 350 soldiers onto the streets, so they're outnumbering the military about 2 to 1. The police simply melt away. I mean, again, this is fighting, and they're fighting again with 50 cals and grenades and this kind of stuff. The civilian population are like, whew, they're people keep picking up their kids from school, and they're like, lock the school, all the parents inside the school, lock the school. People in supermarkets, buying, and just like, look, they're staying there for like the next 12 hours. So the military reckon this happened, the situation's crazy. Then also they start kidnapping. There's certain soldiers who are moving around, and they're like, got them. They start going to the quarters where the families of the military are living. Start going in there. So then you've got the family of the military, and we're gonna the kids and wives. We're gonna take out them. So a few hours afterwards, and there's corruption involved as well. But a few hours afterwards, the Mexican federal government says release Ovidio, release him, stand down. We won. I wrote actually a story then for Time magazine, and I said how the Sinaloa cartel defeated the Mexican army. And I was playing it a bit, but that was humiliation for the military. A lot of military elements of the military were very angry about that, because they were like, well, actually, we were actually winning this on the street, but then the commanders in chief made us step down. Same with the American military said the same stuff in Vietnam, but they're kind of so. This happens, and the Mexican military now, afterwards, you have different things playing out. The Mexican president gets close to the military. The military is getting reinforced. It's getting way more money. It takes over a new force called a National Guard, meant to be a civilian force, then it gets completely controlled by the military, which is basically soldiers or paramilitary police on the streets. Now, they're still corrupt, as I was saying. So it's not really about, I think, about good or bad. They're still corrupt, but they're like, we're beginning to be a real power now. And we've got to remove that stain of being defeated by Sinaloa Cartel. So we're going to go in there again and take out Obidio's man and do it properly. So this time in January, the Mexican president as well is down with this. He's like, that is a bad stain on my presidency. So they go in there. This time they got 3,500 soldiers. So 10 times as many. This time they don't do it they don't arrest him at like midday. They arrest him like in the early hours in the morning. They go down there, they go into a town, shoot up a bunch of people, bang, 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 bang. A lot of deaths there, a lot of civilian deaths. And they take him out. And then they're very, very quickly flying back to Mexico City. Now, when they're flying back, the government even go to the airport and start firing on the planes. And there's like images of civilian, passenger planes, and people are like running, getting under the seats, and they're hearing gunfire coming at their plane before it takes off. But they take him out. Now, it's a way of the government saying, well, we're the ones who are in charge of this. It's reinforcing and going back to the 20th century state. Now, if we look at some other countries in Latin America, we can look at the case of Bukele in El Salvador, if you're familiar with that at all. Bukele I was down there in December. Bukele is a very different situation in terms of the gangs. They're nowhere as powerful as the cartels. But he basically decimated the gangs by putting, of the entire population of El Salvador, he put like within a 9-month period, he put like 65,000 people in prison. It's like, more than 1% of the population in prison within 9 months, as well as already you got another 1% of the population. So it'd be like in the United States, kind of rounding up 3 million people, incarcerating 3 million people in a 9-month period, putting them in mass crowded jails with basically any accusation. But like he decimated the gangs, and people, the population, really support him. Got mass support. He's got like 90% approval. So are we going to see in Latin America more authoritarian governments in the future? Is a reaction to very, very violent crime. And again, I don't in any way relish that. But it's analyzing this and thinking what's likely going to happen and what are the options here. And likely whatever's said, if when you have that kind of threat to the state naturally ends up reinforcing becoming powerful. Then you deal with the problem of an authoritarian state. And how do you deal with that? So can we try and reduce the problems of an authoritarian state while accepting you need some kind of serious law enforcement? You can't really have this level of criminality. In the long term, countries aren't going to live with this.
Why haven't we seen that type of reaction in Mexico? Because I think I've seen countless comments on this where people are saying at any time they could go in, after a video was arrested, they're like, anytime they could go in, they know where Zambada is, they know where Mencho is, they know where these, key players are, they can stop them anytime, but they don't. Is it economically? Because I understand a majority of the money that comes in is, a massive fuel for Mexico's economy. Like, what are the reasons that you don't see any calls for that in Mexico in the same way as you just highlighted in El Salvador, something that they could realistically quickly switch to and honestly probably be able to minimize the problem greatly within, a few years?
Well, I think you have seen in a very different way this kind of, again, this kind of remilitarizing of the state in Mexico. So this has gradually happened. They kind of gradually, really in the last 3 presidents, it's kind of gradually going in this direction. So you've seen, now you're seeing a growth of a military industrial complex and kind of controlling the streets in Mexico. So we're gradually seeing that. Now it's not, they're still corrupt and working with drugs, and it's very, very sensitive there. But like, we are seeing that now. One thing about, maybe in the future we will see a kind of president who'll come in and just say, we've got to fight crime. We're going to kill all of these people, and we're going to forget about, it's the rhetoric of El Salvador is they're terrorists. We're not talking about criminals, we're talking about terrorists. They're all terrorists, and we're going to there's no mercy for terrorists. And if you in the United Nations and Human Rights Watch criticize us, you're foreign idiot liberals who don't understand our problems. If you, and this is what the president of El Salvador, he says, if you want these criminals, we'll give them to you. Okay, you can have them if you want. This is what we're going to have to do to deal with them. Now, and say it's brutal. I mean, I've been down and it's tough. I mean, what it really means in practice on the streets is, you got a house. I heard this story dozens of times. You got a house there. You got a woman there with a 18-year-old kid. Knock on the door. Oh, hello. Yeah. We're just going to come. Your son's got to come in for a few checks. Oh, but he's under. No, don't worry about it. He's going to come in for a few checks to the station, and he'll be back here in a couple of hours. Okay. Take him down the station. Bang, he's gone in the system. No contact with him. He's been in prison for months. He's got the this very standard charge of kind of like gang affiliation, or not even gang connections. Bang, he's on that, and they're in the system, and they're in a very crowded prison, and they're now in Mexico. The difference in Mexico is in El Salvador, you got a small country, 6-7 million people, and you have the gangs with less guns, less firepower than in Mexico. A lot of them have more like pistols. Some of them have like long arms. Not really, and they went in very, very fast, and bang, all of these guys are locked up. The first wave locked up, and then carried on very, very hard. In Mexico, much bigger country, 130 million people, 2 million square kilometers, a dozen cartels, the big ones, the medium ones, and then the lower ones, and then a whole bunch of more cartelitos, they call them, like smaller organizations around the country, but also with a whole bunch of firepower. And you saw this under Felipe Calderon, where there was corruption involved, but also Felipe Calderon was trying to kind of reimpose the state, the President Felipe Calderon, 2006, 2012. But you saw this, the military would go to Michoacan. Now, if you get into military doctrine and counterinsurgency, then you say the problem is with fighting guerrilla organizations, and the cartels, when they're confronted by a big bunch of military, they can melt back and become like guerrillas. When the military are not there, they can come out and be like paramilitaries and be like, we're running this and we're driving through towns, showing off our guns, and we're just like, we're the ones running this. When you get a big military build up in a place, they can melt away and become like guerrillas. And then they can ambush and kill soldiers and kidnap and do these kind of things, harass them. But they melt away, which means you can have a military there, and then these guys can go to the hills, and then the military can leave and then come back again. So they say to try and fight, and this gets to kind of counterinsurgency doctrine, you have to control every square mile of territory. So you need huge numbers of troops. They don't really have them in Mexico to do that. And the problem is you start doing one state, you start doing Michoacan, and it's all kicking off in Tamaulipas and Ciudad Juárez and Durango and Tijuana, and then you could go to those. So, in Mexico, maybe one thing they'd have to kind of pacify the country block by block, or see a kind of gradual pushback, but that kind of extreme kind of thing, or they, maybe we will see it one day. I'm not saying it necessarily would work. It's a very tough problem in Mexico.
I think one of the most famous, I don't know the quote verbatim, but it was highlighted early on, where you had the original narco pimp. Why am I blanking on his name right now? The Godfather. Guadalajara Cartel. I don't know if
Amado. The very, myself. I'm some tired myself as well. It's
Miguel Felix Gallardo.
Miguel Felix Gallardo.
There we go. Yeah, it's crazy. I just blanked on that. Yeah. when he was arrested, obviously Mexico was quote unquote maybe a little bit more tame in terms of the violence you saw. And then a famous phrase that kind of came from him was that the lines have been released. Like you no longer have anybody there to control them. Could you look at it from a perspective as well? Because as you're saying, it's such a difficult problem to deal with when you have 2 million square miles you're dealing with, you have 130 million people, and going block to block isn't, that's not something that when you have 130 million people is easy to say, this is what we're going to do. Do you maybe look at it as beneficial as some of these governments consider focusing on other cartel groups and letting one power player rise? And I'd love to get into your conversation a little bit more with Calderon, because I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book. But, there's rumors about him partnering with Sinaloa, trying to allow them to bring control, quote unquote, to the drug game. Do you look at that as an out that Mexico would consider as well?
So I think that's something they've basically been trying to reimpose as well in recent years, and it hasn't worked. This is basically how things functioned, again, and going back to Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, who ran the first, or known as the Guadalajara cartel, or the first kind of big cartel in Mexico. So the idea you have a powerful cartel which can control and reduce violence. Now, this has worked in areas for a certain time, and you saw the Mexican president says about Sinaloa. In Sinaloa, we've got violence has gone down. We've got one powerful cartel. The current president said this about it. If you look in Brazil, in a place called in the city of Sao Paulo, in the state of Sao Paulo, you've got one major crime organization there, known as the First Commando of the Capital. They really control and reduce violence, and it kind of works. However, they're also then they had a beef with the government one time, and then they shut down the city and started shooting loads of policemen and burning banks and shutting everything down because they're that powerful. So you have one very, very powerful cartel. They can confront the state, but they can also tell the state, well, we can kind of calm things down. So in a way, you're kind of choosing between, do you want a cancerous tumor or do you want to have HIV? It's like, which of these two kind of shitty options. Even saying that, within Mexico, they kind of tried that, and it's not really, they kind of tried to reimpose that in various places the last few years, and it hasn't worked. Why is it not working in Mexico now? You got too many players, so you already now the cartels are too fragmented in many places. State of Guerrero is maybe the worst in terms of cartel fragmentation, where you have a dozen different groups and these cartelitos and these new groups, Los Tlacos, some of these new groups, Los Tequileros, these new groups appearing. I had some friends down there, they were covering this one group, some kid in his early 20s, El Güero Palaya, and he had some kids, he had 200 kids, literally kids. I mean, he had teenagers, but even there's kids as young as 12 following around, blocking the roads. And there's hundreds of these kids around with AKs, and this friend of mine was up there, and they were going to cover some of these things. 7 journalists took away their vehicles, and he said the kids came up to them guns in their faces, took away their vehicles, took away their cameras, took away their laptops, took away their their IDs and their wallets and stuff. And he was saying, so one kid was 12. And the kid who was out of guns with him was like, God, I could take the gun out of this guy's hand, but it's not really going to be a good idea. So you get it kind of fragmented. And these are kind of the fragments of the fragments of the fragments. They kind of taken down the big kingpin, and his lieutenant was being controlled. They took him out, and then they end up with these kind of El Güero Palaya and his 200 psychopathic kids he's got behind him, controlling some chunk of road in countryside of Mexico. So you've got all these different players around, and they haven't really got so you go and talk to somebody. You got the plaza here, you got control, but then other people are challenging them still. So they haven't been able to do that or kind of reimpose that in certain places. They get it, certain cities, and there'll be deals made. Ciudad Juárez, the worst front of all the different fights in Mexico over the last 20 years. Ciudad Juarez, 10,000 dead between 2008 and 2011, 10,000 dead in that city. Eventually, it ended up with a peace deal. The Juarez cartel has one section of the city. The Sinaloa cartel has another section. Big road between divides them. So kind of government-backed police deal at the time. Okay, well, just stop killing each other. Who's there left to kill now? You killed 10,000 people. Just put your guns down for a bit, and you guys can make some money. They kind of do that, but in the long term, it's still unstable. So I don't know. I mean, it may be, it can work, and it has worked, and that's kind of getting back to truces made as well, kind of government truces with certain things. It can definitely work in the short term, but it's still a problem in the long term. Now, what Bukele did in El Salvador, likely, was he made a truce with the gangs, revived the truce with the gangs, to say, stop killing each other, you've got your territories. And then I rebuild the military, and then he turned on them and put them all in prison. So maybe that again, we're going to get to maybe solutions to some of this. But again, I mean, this stuff. A lot of what I've done or the work I see it. I mean, when a few years ago, I kind of felt I had solutions, and now the more I've worked and reported on this, maybe the less I kind of see clear solutions to it. I mean, bigger stuff. I mean, we can talk about drug policy reform, which is trying to reduce the money going to them. We can talk about how you revive the neighborhoods and change the reality of these neighborhoods so kids don't get recruited into cartels, and how you build real police forces. And I kind of still have those three kind of spheres, but these are really hard long-term goals to do this.
I agree with that. I think even if you look at the U.S. too, a lot of that perspective can be flipped immediately to, some of the cities you highlight, like Baltimore. If you look at Memphis, if you look at some of these cities where, the death rate is outrageously high, it could quickly fall if you make some of those adjustments. But I think one of the things we don't have in the U.S. is the brutality, and that's to be expected. But it seems like the cartel brutality has just continued to skyrocket. You highlighted the Zetas earlier, how they were the unique one out of an already chaotic situation, but it seems like they pushed it to another level, and it has just continued moving forward from there. So why do you think the brutality has skyrocketed so much? And what do you think that plays in it as well? Whether it's for the citizens on the ground, as you were talking about, wanting to form some of these, militia groups to stand against the cartels, or if it's even the politicians, the police, whoever it might be as well.
So, I spent a lot of time the last 20 years talking to the murderers and talking to people who are carrying out this brutality. And trying to get into their own minds. I mean, I feel as a journalist, part of our work is we've got to report on this, tell these stories. We've got to understand it. So, how come, what's your story? How come, you're doing this? How do you feel about this? Do you feel guilty? So we see a few factors. One is that a lot of the people who are recruited or carrying out the violence are people who are very violent, hateful people. And I say hateful, in some cases you have literal psychopaths or people who really, who kind of, you always find that in any case, the kind of guy would be the serial killer, the kind of bully. You're going to find them. They're going to rise in this situation. But a lot of them are not necessarily like that. But one guy, I profiled him in the book Blood, Gun, Money. A guy in Honduras, and it's an example of someone like this, someone I got a bit closer to. But he was abandoned as a kid by both his parents. Actually, his mom had gone to the United States, and so again, you get some of these immigration things can be some of the immigration patterns can actually be very hurtful for a lot of people in these countries. Is people abandoning their countries to flee their countries to go to the different country and then leaving kids behind and this kind of stuff. But he grew up kind of abandoned, so very, basically dumped as a kid and kind of on the street, and was kind of very, very hateful, had this hate in his heart. And this is a guy I went and got drunk with this guy. Went to a club, and I didn't realize quite how deep he was in, first of all. But he was kind of, he was kind of had a nice side to him. Quite a good looking, kind of well built guy. But he had this hate in his heart. And then when I eventually interviewed him and talked to him about this stuff, I'd known him a couple of years before it happened. And he described it because when he was abandoned as a kid, and then he was some other kid on the street said, "Oh, there's a house we can rob and take you some money from." And they went in there, and it was actually a kind of woman who looked after a bunch of kids. And the kid who'd taken him there had lived there and had kind of had an abusive environment and wanted revenge. And they went in there. These are the kids. They went in there, and they butchered everybody in the house. And that was like, I mean, once you've done that, it's kind of no going back. But he got in the mentality of, I don't care. I don't give a fuck about the world. The world's been horrible to me. I don't give a fuck about the world. I'm going to get what's mine. So then they get up, start rising up and robbing people, and then it gets noticed by the gangsters, and then they recruit him as a cartel hitman, and he starts carrying out murders and starts decapitating people and doing all this crazy gangster stuff. And then at the same time, he's kind of having a family, has a family and has kids, and is like, I want my kids to grow up with a dad, and it's kind of weird. And then eventually he ends up getting murdered. So that becomes that thing. Now I talk to people who recruit young kids for the cartels and stuff, and they're like, we look out for those kids. We look out for the kids who've got. It's not going to be good for us to come nice kid who's lives in. No, we want kids who are being brutalized. So it's this kind of a circle that goes on, because think about what's happened in Mexico the last 20 years, right? More than way more than 250,000 probably cartel related murders the last 20 years in Mexico. Insane. Of those people who have been murdered, they've got kids who are growing up. My dad was like some setter who got, but also they're people who committed the murders, they've got kids. So it's people growing up now who are like second, third generation, more, like with this stuff, with this violence. So this is all kind of driving it. But also, I think if you get to the more mechanical thing so when I talk to people, it's like, do you feel guilty? Now sometimes some of them do have guilt, some of them don't. Some of them, they find Christ in prison and that kind of thing. But one of the things that takes away their guilt is they're like, I'm under orders. I'm fighting in a war and I'm under orders. If you're like, if you do something bad and you feel, like if you're like a violent guy, but you're in like, I don't know, you're in a bar and somebody disrespects you and you get angry and you kind of, and you think, oh God, that was my mistake. I should have calmed down. I should have just bit my tongue and walked away. It's my fault. Then that's one thing you could feel guilty about. And then if you like, I don't know, if you went too far and you killed somebody, you're like, I feel bad about I killed that kid. I feel bad about that. That was my fault. That was on me. But if you're in a cartel and you've got orders, nothing you can do about it. You've got orders. You've got to go there and you've got to kill that guy. I'm under orders. I can't not do it, or they're going to kill me. So there's a certain guilt taken away, and these are understanding them as machines of violence, as structures. Now, what happens? What's the logic of cartel warfare? The logic is you have to control the territory. How do you control the territory? So this is, this goes back to militaries. You had in the Guatemalan Civil War, you had the military wanted to control villages, which have guerrilla, insurgent groups don't get there. So they go in a village and like, we need to commit terror. So we're going to get a couple of people who we know are working with the guerrillas, and we're going to decapitate them in front of everyone, and stick their heads here. So you use terror to control the territory. That's what the cartels do. They're unleashed. Their military is unleashed without any kind of responsibility or any kind of structure. If it's not like, you're going to like and have to, you're going to commit terror. So then it escalates. They leave 12 decapitated bodies. Oh, they leave 12. We're going to leave 28. Was an escalation of terror, and also terror done publicly, terror done through the internet. Propaganda war on the internet as well with this terror. To control, to have power, and you've got guys unleashed with. What happened in Vietnam when you had the American, a bunch of kids, from maybe some of them might be nice kids from these different towns and cities around the United States, and you put them in Vietnam, and suddenly they commit a massacre and rape and stuff in some villages. Same thing with these. You unleash a bunch of guys in these areas with guns and power, and you guys are, they're not going to commit rape, and they're not going to commit murder, and they're not going to just shake people down and make money, and they're going to behave nicely. I mean, these. So I think that's part of the thing. It's kind of understand it as an armed conflict, as a weird hybrid armed conflict. Again, the big question is, how do you get out of this? How do you pull back from this? And it becomes what it's been in some ways is a war that cannot be won, but cannot be stopped. So it's kind of stuck in this endemic violence. And it's like, how do we stop this thing? We can't win this thing, actually. And we throw more stuff into it, but also we can't just press a button and stop this thing. So how can we wind this down? It's got to stop eventually. But it might be another decade at least before this thing stops. So specifically with the gun issue, right? And when I looked at this, one of the things that kind of really makes me think is, I mean, you've got a couple of 100,000 guns a year going to the cartels. You've got this blatant buying, going to shops. In some cases, going 10 AK-47s, please. People buying blatantly and openly these weapons and taking them down to Mexico and using them in this extreme violence. So it's not the kind of basic enforcement is not done. And, when I sat down and talked to, the head of the AR-15 owners of America, I was like, yeah, okay, you're into AR-15s. Do you believe that the cartel should be sold all these guns? Maybe not. Talk to even like militia members I talked to, real kind of Second Amendment fundamentalists. I was like, do you believe in arming the cartels? So I mean, beyond the debate, and I don't even get into the debate about assault rifle bans or like any of that stuff, or changing the Second Amendment, any of that stuff. Forgetting about any of that. Just basically with the current laws now, why is this not working? Why is there not basic enforcement and these guns going to the cartels? So the basic stuff that can be done, and these are suggestions that I put in the book, which actually some got bought in to the bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022. Was one, okay, so you got like four main methods that the cartels are acquiring firearms. One is through straw buyers. So straw buyer, if anyone who doesn't know, somebody's got a clean record. Hey Reed, can you buy me a couple of AK-47s? You got a clean license. I've got a bit of a problem. Can you buy them for me? Oh, sure, I'll get them for you. I'll give you $100 a pop. This is the biggest way that they're really getting guns. And you look at these, and there's cases. There's one case where a guy walked in a store, bought 10 AK-47s. They gave him $600 payment plus the money for the guns. One of the guns was used in the murder of an American agent. The guy got probation. Crime was lying on a form. So one thing is simply clamping down on that. If you're buying guns for the cartel, you're involved in, if you know this, if you know the guy you're selling to is like cartel affiliated guy. In that particular one, it was the guy's buying marijuana off this guy, but he was a guy linked to the Zetas in Mexico. So this is, this is a suspect guy. And if this guy asks you to buy 10 AK-47s, that's a serious crime, right? It shouldn't be probation. And it sounds bad, saying for like lock people up, but it's like this is just basic law enforcement to clamp down on these guys. If people are consciously buying guns for the cartel, now again, this issue of terrorism thing, if you were to call them terrorist groups, you could give them 25 years. But even without that, even just like right now, just changing sentencing guidelines. And that was kind of partly done. They've got to actually enforce this stuff now and get it out of the message. But just saying to people, if you're consciously buying guns for the cartel, it's not about, you can have your right to bear arms. If you've got a clean record, you can buy a gun to defend yourself. But if you're buying a gun for a drug cartel, that's a crime. That's the first thing. Second thing, which is there's some dispute about, but universal background checks. The vast majority according to the surveys, the vast majority of conservatives, of gun owners, are in favor of universal background checks. It's simply saying because they're abusing these. There's cases of this on tape and proven as guys who are like buying huge amounts of guns and then reselling them as private sales, and they're going to cartels, to gangs. It's a way of trafficking. They're abusing this to traffic guns. If you just say every time there's a gun sale, there's kind of ID checked, so that you're not blatantly selling these to criminals. At least that's the second measure. Some things with I would say particularly buying the Barrett 50s, the 50 caliber, some kind of extended background check. If someone's an extreme hobbyist and wants a 50 cal, and I talked to guys, I spent time at the SHOT Show, which is the biggest firearms trade show in the world in Las Vegas. I talked to guys there with like 50 cal enthusiasts. One guy was describing how he was firing at a deer, and the shot missed, but the vibration made the deer explode anyway. Because he was saying if you're an extreme hobbyist, again, without even getting into the argument, Second Amendment, okay, you've got a right to have that. But some kind of background check, extended background check, and saying, okay, who wants to buy 50 cal? Because the fact that you've got like some kid in a baseball cap with $10,000 in cash buying it, and then they're gone. They might pass the background check, the instant background check, but then you've got it, and you find out, we sold some 50 cals. Oh right, they're gone, and they're in Mexico, and they're being used to blow off soldiers' legs. And then looking at the ghost guns, which is like another method now, the ghost guns. The fourth method is stealing, which is not a huge thing for the cartels because they prefer new guns. But there's stuff like simply where people have gun shops where they have unlocked safes, where like criminals have gone in there and just put a lock on your safe. These kind of basic measures that I think the vast majority of gun owners agree with. And just saying, just try and stop guns going to criminals. Kind of basic stuff. That's what I advocate. The book's mainly a work of investigation, not argument or preaching to look at this issue. But like to say, the basic stuff could make a real big difference. It hasn't been done. And okay, there's an argument. Okay, if you don't get them from the United States, they'll get them from China or Russia or somewhere else. The thing is, first of all, if you've got like a kid who's like, in a playground, and some kid is like, like stabbing kids, and you're selling them knives, and you say, oh, we'll get knives from somewhere. We've got muzzle selling the knives anyway. You still got a responsibility if you're selling guns to these people. But the second thing is, it makes a difference how easy they're getting and how cheap they are. I've been at these scenes where they'll shoot, 500 bullets, and they'll kill not only the guy in the car, but the pregnant woman in the car behind, and the guy selling tacos on the side of the street, because they've got as many bullets as they want, and they like firing, they like firing them on. They buy a semi-automatic in the US, and they turn it to full automatic and just spray. But also then they got guns. They then use the guns in some murder and then sell them cheaply to some kid. And so you have kids in school with guns and kind of a whole, So the level of guns, even if you made it more difficult to acquire guns, made them more expensive, that'll make a difference. So I think tackling the gun trafficking, and there's basic stuff that could be done. Now, I have hopes that the progress can be made on this, but I think it makes it difficult when you've got such a divided political environment in the United States. because there's not really a kind of idea of we're going to kind of work together to try and solve issues. It's like we're just kind of we hate them, they hate us, and we're. And also, a lot of the politicians in the United States on both sides aren't looking for clear, real solutions. They're kind of looking for stuff which is stuff they can use on social media, which can kind of go off, rather than saying, "Here's a real problem. How do we find real solutions to this?"
Do you think if they saw what was going on down south in the ways you've seen it, like literally on the ground, and actually had to see what the Iron River is actually causing, do you think that could help change the tune as well? Like, this is part of the reason, like I said, I was so excited to be able to have you on as a guest and for people to continue to pushing on what's happening, is because I feel like there's very much a lack of knowledge on what's going on. So do you think that that should be something as well, that we need our politicians, our people that are in these power positions to actually look at what's happening down south?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and I think people need to understand it, but also it's about having conversations and like, I'll be happy to sit in a room with anybody from any side and talk about this stuff. Currently, politics is kind of broken, and it's hard to find real solutions. And this is, fentanyl is a seriously big problem. Fentanyl, and it is devastating, and they need to get very seriously. But it's how to kind of, the current political environment and politics itself is not working. So are we in a stage now as well where these kind of politics we had, the kind of structures we had, the institutions we had, like worked in the 20th century, worked in moments of the 20th century, kind of worked in the 1950s, 1960s, and you kind of had a kind of thing of these things working, and they're no longer fit for purpose. So, are we living through a kind of change in institutions that have been thrown off by staff, and so now these are not functioning well, perhaps. But yeah, sure. I mean, part of that, where we need to try and inform people, absolutely. That's what much of a journalist is. But in the US, how do we actually get pragmatic solutions to real problems? Maybe like looking at sometimes if the people sitting down looking at the real things. Now, also talking about the violence, there is. I mean, the US has got this horrific problem with fentanyl. The US is vulnerable to spillover violence from Mexico, and we saw a massacre in California, cartel-style massacre in a town in California, in January, where they killed the baby and the young mother and the granny, and it's like horrific massacre there. Gang related, but kind of gang linked to cartel stuff. And we got dangers, these things have been held back in the United States for some years, but there's danger that is spilling over. So it's kind of good to be conscious about it now and think, okay, and also care about what's happening in Mexico, because it's linked to Mexico, but also think about how you deal with the United States and how you avoid the United States in 10, 15, 20 years time looking more like Mexico.
So we were just talking about cartels kind of slowly almost gaining influence in the US, and you highlighted an example in California. I think a pretty underrated thing that's happening in California as well is the cartel is actually starting to grow marijuana there, and I think even starting to indulge in, creating other drugs there, so they basically don't have to cross the border. Are you seeing an increase in this, in the cartel's influence in the US, whether it's direct with how they impact, the gang and the gang cultures we have, or maybe even in more specifically our politics, our social culture, and in a lot of ways that they actually have an impact in Mexico?
So the cartels in the United States are certainly becoming more entrenched and stronger. You've had, cartel activity in the United States for many decades. As the cartels have grown and you've had them, moving around drugs there. What you've seen in the last few years is you've seen the cartel structures have become bigger in Mexico and more, more powerful. And then you've seen it going. So you have, look at these new cartels like the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and the new factions of Sinaloa Cartel like Los Chapitos, more, deeper networks of distribution in the United States. So if you go back 20 years, you have where, they have cartels like saying, well, we sell, we're the big wholesalers. We don't really care about selling down. So you had like drug traffickers going back to the 90s, early 2000s, selling cocaine. And they're the Mexicans are the big wholesalers. And they sell down to American organizations. There's one called the Black Mafia Family. They're involved, and they're more like the distributors and stuff, and then other groups in the US. With the new ones like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they've become like more of those mid-level dealers as well in the United States. So they're actually selling it more at that kind of kilo level as well. They're kind of more affiliated directly with the people in Mexico. Now, in the United States, when there's been cartel-related murders, and there's been a couple of big cases of this, US law enforcement hit it very hard. One case was some Zetas doing some murders around Texas in the 2000s. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, it's all good. So one case was you had one case in the 2000s of people in Texas around the like Rio Grande Valley area, around the Laredo area. Some murders carried out there, and the Zetas were a bit of a breakaway group, really, a kind of rebellious group inside the Mexican drug war, and that was clamped down on quite hard. And now you had a case in California of a group called Los Palillos, who were like a breakaway group from the Ariana Felix cartel. And they carried out a bunch of murders. This is a story which wasn't really well known, but they dissolved bodies and stuff. I went to a ranch where they dissolved bodies on the California side. Recently went to the site of it, but they were carrying out a bunch of murders, and then they were hit pretty hard. So the cartels generally learned a lesson was, the United States is our land of milk and honey. This is where we make billions and billions of dollars. And we don't really want to upset law enforcement or make real noise here. We want to sell drugs here. And in Mexico, we do what we like because Mexico's out of control. However, these are building up, and this could change. Also, you had in California the gangs who were affiliated, working with the cartels, like the Mexican mafia. They created their own rules, and they reduced violence themselves. Going back from the 1990s, they banned drive-by shootings, because obviously drive-by shootings, you can kill innocent people. So you have to go up with a gun and kill your victim. You can't kill women, you can't kill kids. These are the rules that they have. This gang murder we saw in January was worrying because it was like breaking those rules. Now, the problem with these rules, they can be kept in, and you have hard law enforcement, which help. But now we've seen the last couple of years demoralization in US law enforcement. A lot of people leaving. A lot of people fed up. Rising drug abuse on the streets. A lot of issues that start to come out. And could we start to see like cartel murders creeping up? Again, you've got to keep an eye on that. Now, we're not really seeing it yet, so I don't want to overplay the problem, but I think it's something that we need to be vigilant about. Another side, so you also have on one side the cartels, the other side you have MS-13. So MS-13 are also, you've got this kind of now this East Coast group of MS-13, they're like a new kind of group has arisen. They're big. I talked to a guy who had in Honduras who'd run an MS-13 clique in Maryland. They started doing things like shakedowns within the migrant communities. And again, forget about the race. This can be because I talked to white American guys who've been working for cartels doing this stuff. MS-13 start recruiting, different people of, right, not just, Latin, like I said, Americans start recruiting people, recruiting Chinese guys and different people in these areas. So it can be like, it's not, a race thing or a question of immigrant status. And sometimes, this gets, politically it's been a very charged issue because of, this question of Trump and so forth. But this is a very concerning thing of law enforcement. And in fact, it's the people from the migrant communities who are the most vulnerable to the kidnappings, to the shakedowns, to all of this stuff. A lot of them are very concerned about the issue of cartels, issue of organized crime in these places.
So we've talked about the U.S. and we've talked about Mexico. There's another power player, which we've highlighted a little bit earlier with fentanyl, would be China. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy about how much they're actually a role player within the fentanyl import. Obviously, there's been calls in the U.S. that they are the main player, but the CCP recently came out this week and essentially said that they have no background and they have no involvement in any of the fentanyl that's supplied to the U.S. Do you think that, for one, the CCP knows and has some coordination with the cartels trying to be able to kind of push this forward into the U.S. border? And two, is that how would we be able to handle that situation as well, seeing as we talk about great ideas of how to, whether it's, we look at militarization or we look at ways that we can, change the society and culture down there and in the U.S., but you have these other power players around the world as well who are looking into funneling what's essentially poison right through our southern border.
Yeah. So, first with China, it looks, from what I've seen, the evidence is that this stuff's coming out of China in a big way, and also out of by Chinese chemists in India, some other places. When I saw these statements by the Chinese officials, it's like complete denial. It wasn't like, oh, we're trying to crack down on it, but we're doing other. It was like, there is no fentanyl trafficking from China to Mexico. It doesn't exist. So and I was kind of a bit knocked down by that statement. It's like with the guns. Like you say, well, US got responsibility with guns, and US will say, well, we're trying to fight this and blah, blah, blah. But it's not like there is no complete denial. And that kind of reflects a bit how this Chinese structure works. It's a very different political language. It's not like it's just like there is no trafficking. So how do you begin to start? Now, I don't know China. I don't know what their motivations are. I'm sure it's an authoritarian state, so they know this is happening. You get into this. It is the fact. Without getting too conspiratorial, do they care if this fentanyl is going and killing lots of Americans and weakening the United States, when that's their main economic, kind of military, geopolitical rival? Or just, you could flip it again, go back to the US. Do Americans care that much that guns are destabilizing Mexico and stuff? It's not happening right in their neighborhoods. It's difficult. This stuff gets away, but are there other motivations there? So Mexico, people start getting conspiratorial, like, oh well, the United States wants to destabilize Mexico, wants to weaken Mexico. That's why they're trafficking the guns down here. And I can get into Fast and Furious. I haven't mentioned Fast and Furious, which is also something which some very well-informed listeners might well know about and be questioning, where there was an operation by the ATF where they knew about these guns being trafficked to try and create a bigger sting, a bigger conspiracy case, and then ended up being involved, which makes it look like the US state is deliberately kind of arming these cartels, which kind of fuels conspiracies down here. So people are like, well, the Americans are deliberately doing this stuff to make Mexico weak. I don't believe that. I think it's actually various reasons why the United States is allowing these guns to go south. It's not all part of a big plan. With China, I don't know. I don't know enough about them inside, their motives, their players, but it's happening. To talk about fentanyl, I think, and again, fentanyl is a big game changer that's happened. To try and make some sense of fentanyl, I think also we want to bring crystal meth into the conversation as well. Crystal meth's huge in the United States. So we've seen a change in the drugs the biggest drugs now being trafficked in the United States by the cartels. It used to be cocaine, heroin, marijuana. Now the biggest are fentanyl and crystal meth. We moved, I mean, first with marijuana and cocaine. With marijuana, you could say, well, people smoke it, now we've kind of legalized it anyway. So that was kind of like, why are we fighting a war against marijuana? It didn't really make sense. I do believe in marijuana legalization. It hasn't solved the problem of cartels, but I do believe in marijuana legalization. Cocaine, I mean, it caused, crack caused a lot of damage. Also, the sales of it caused a lot of damage. But kind of cocaine is a bit more of a mixed thing. A lot of people take cocaine for recreation. There's a bit more of a kind of mix in there. Crystal meth and fentanyl do insane damage. It's also a change from plants to synthetic chemicals. Like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, they all came from, marijuana was a plant and you literally smoked the plant. Cocaine, you had the coca leaf. You went through a bit of a process, but it was kind of a bit closer to the plant, the coca leaf. Even heroin, a bit closer to the opium stuff. It was still kind of a chemical process, but synthetic stuff where you're creating and synthesizing chemicals at this level, it's a lot further away from any kind of natural thing there to these synthetic chemicals technology linked to the pharmaceutical industry. So they're kind of piggybacking off the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry creates, and China's obviously massive for this, creates a lot of these chemicals, and then we can take derivatives from chemicals and then make them into these things and sell them. And you've got an alternative pharmaceutical industry alongside the real one, which is, fentanyl, crystal meth. So it kind of gets deep into this stuff. I mean, the prices are crazy how cheaply you can buy some of these precursors for. I mean, so, you can buy some of these precursors. You might buy $1,000 worth of precursors and make $1 million worth of drugs. That's what these guys are looking at. That's why they're motivated to do this stuff. And the effects, I mean, you see, I used to know heroin addicts back in the UK when I was a teenager, and they were bad. You could talk to them. I was recently up in Tijuana, talking to some people on fentanyl, on crystal meth, and these guys are zombied. These guys are zombified. I mean, this stuff's, I think, messing up their whole system way more. So how do we deal with this stuff? And this is kind of, I think, getting a bit into a kind of deeper issue. This is kind of part of maybe we've kind of become so removed from nature, so removed from our removed from nature, removed from communities, removed from family, all this kind of stuff. And then we end up with these people taking these chemicals. They're broken. They don't talk to their family. They got no community sense. They got no, and then they're taking these chemicals which are just like out there by this break off from the pharmaceutical industry. So it gets maybe some kind of deep issues about what these pharmaceuticals mean. But China's not a good faith player in this. Absolutely not.
Why do you think that the Mexican cartels are interested in putting fentanyl into the drugs? I mean, is it simply just money? Is it simply that it's easier to package and cross the U.S. border? Is there, is more motivation behind the scenes? You had an interesting conversation in the book with Jelly Roll, and I love the name, by the way, but he highlighted how every drug dealer in his mind felt remorse because they knew that this was going to be killing somebody. Someone that they supplied to, would evidently die. When you look at the fentanyl trade, a lot of people are dying. And when those are your customer base, I just can't imagine that they look at it as this long-term economic opportunity to continue to supply the U.S. I feel like it would eventually hurt the bottom line. And overall, it feels the amount that they're actually putting into these drugs as well, eventually it'll create kind of a negative feedback loop. So what is the motivation there? Is it simply just money, or do you think there's other aspects to it?
So yeah, Jerry Roll's a very interesting character, a dealer who was a drug dealer in Baltimore and sold heroin and crack, and felt guilty because he was like, now I think he was being generous by saying every drug dealer, or maybe he was talking about the drug dealers there for where he's from. I think he knew that he was kind of poisoning his own community. So that he kind of, thought back and, he described when he was at high school, and suddenly he could be like earning thousands of dollars every week. And like, why go to high school? They're like these are the they're like 17 years old and they're like going to nightclubs and they got buy brand new clothes and having girlfriends who are in their 20s and they kind of live in this, but then they're selling drugs which are poisoning their own community. So then later on in life, he feels some guilt about that. I don't think. I think if you look at people like Los Chapitos, they're pretty cold. They're not really. They're pretty far away. Now, some of them, interestingly, will ban. I mean, I think the Chapitos will ban selling fentanyl inside their communities in Sinaloa. So when they see their communities in Sinaloa, in Mexico, they're like, we don't want to sell fentanyl to our own friends' kids and stuff. But when this stuff's gone up to a different country, and they're kind of separated from it. So I think they kind of cut off. And plus, like I described earlier, the brutality of Mexican organized crime is like, you got to be, you can't be too generous in this game. You got to be cold. You got to be very aggressive. I think they're motivated by money. It's logistically, the profit's so big. Like I talk about, like with cocaine was massive money, but cocaine still, you do things like, okay, cocaine, you buy it from the Colombians and it might sell for $2,000 a key. But then you've got to move it all the way from Colombia up to Mexico, and then it gets sold in Mexico for like $10,000 a key, and then you flip it over the border and sell it for like just flip it over the border, sell it for $15,000 a key, and then it kind of move it through the United States and it gets 25, 30. So you invest money, get money back. You're making big money. But say this stuff you buy $1,000 worth of chemicals, flip them to $1 million. The profit's insane. That's what's really motivating them. But also, like, you then avoid so many different parts of the process. So when they make heroin, you've got a bunch of people growing opium poppies. You've got a long process. They've got to plant the poppies. They've got to wait several months and then harvest the poppies. Then they're in the mountains. The Mexican military can go there. It can burn them down, or it can go there and say, well, give us some money and we'll let you keep these poppies. Then you got to process them, and then move them. Then they eventually become the and it's quite bulky. Fentanyl, don't worry about that. All you got to do is just get an order and get some precursor chemicals or some finished fentanyl from China, from Asia, and then bring it in. You make sure it comes in a container. It's way smaller. It's nice and interesting thing about the logistics of this. Marijuana, okay, old school marijuana is massive. These big marijuana busts. Some of them made some bust. They fill up a football stadium with the amount of marijuana they busted. Huge amounts. Cocaine. It's a lot smaller, but it's still these bricks of cocaine. The big busts, huge places. Heroin, smaller still, and then like fentanyl, little chemicals. You could just stash. You could have this a glass full of fentanyl. It's enough to kill millions of people. Just stick that in a car. Stick that in a gas tank of a car. So this stuff now, it's kind of like, how are they going to stop this? I mean, it's kind of a game changer. It kind of throws off. They're trying now. They're saying, well, Mexico's got to clamp down. Let's see how this plays out. But the scale of it. So I think just logistics and money, the motivation has been. Now, one of the things that perhaps they miscalculated or a consequence of this, and some of these guys are not, I mean, the cartels are extremely sophisticated and extremely clever in their operations, and they've grown organically over decades. But some of the people are not necessarily that forward thinking. So they're just thinking like, they're kind of thinking operationally, bring in product, move product, sell, but they also got a million things on their mind. We're dealing with the other, the Jalisco cartels fighting us in this territory. We've got to pay off this, they've got little things going on. So not necessarily thinking long-term game plan. One thing they perhaps miscalculated, or one consequence they're seeing now, is the political reaction in the United States has rightfully been big in reaction to fentanyl deaths. So how do we, now they're seeing a reaction, and then now they're seeing, new indictments just come out against Los Chapitos. They're like, bring these guys down because fentanyl. So they're seeing a reaction. But I don't know. It's going to be very interesting the next few years, next few months, next few years, how this plays out. If we continue seeing this, or if the current opioid epidemic is going to kind of burn itself out in the United States. And if you have 107,000 people dying in a year, is that less addicts now? I don't know. I mean, or is it just more people coming?
So do you see some of these kingpins? You obviously were at El Chapo's trial. You've had so much experience, and the crazy thing about it, it's the kingpins, they come and go. There's only a few that have ever made it, for decades long in the game. Do you think they understand who they are and what role they really play in this? I mean, one of the things I see, it's a crazy dynamic. You look at someone like El Chapo, then moves to the Chapitos, the family takes over. There's so much respect, and there's so much, you would expect that in such a brutal game, it's constant new people popping up, but there is that level of respect for the family. So you think they understand who they are, like the role they play, what the impact is that they're having?
It's a very interesting question. I've had the opportunity to talk to some of these kingpins, some quite high level people, more recently, and it's kind of sad to say. I mean, they kind of make a pact with the devil, I would say. At some point when they get into this, they kind of make a pact with the devil, and I think I guess like all human beings, we're all heroes in our own stories. So they don't see themselves as being villains. They kind of, in their own world as well, got their own kind of motivated with their own ego. Like, who's the best drug trafficker? Who's the biggest drug trafficker? Some of them do literally kind of satanic shit, like cannibalism and stuff. But kind of ritualized cannibalism is kind of part of. I mean, maybe an old school guy like El Mayo. El Mayo, you mentioned El Mayo a couple of times, and he's an interesting character. I mean, El Mayo's hasn't been arrested. That guy is going to run. How many hundreds of millions has he made? And was he sitting in some village in Sinaloa still? And kind of old school. But he's going to die soon. The kind of big power players now, El Mencho, these guys are pretty brutal. The Chapitos, kind of pretty brutal. The new power players come up under them. In terms of how they see themselves, I mean, it was going back to the Knights Templar. You had a character there, a kind of Colonel Kurt's character from Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now, where he kind of had this power, and then he was supposedly killed, and then he kind of he walked around in white robes, and people thought he was a ghost, and he wrote his own Bible and kind of made people kind of learn his words and kind of got complete ego state. So you get kind of some cases like that, or going back to Pablo Escobar, decided, well, I want to be a politician and I'll be a president. They're interesting. I mean, they are people who have come from below, and are smart, talented, driven people who have kind of created these alternative power structures. Some of them, the ostentatiousness. They're going to have some of them are just, it's just about women. I mean, they're just, like these, they're like kind of how you imagine some rock and roll stars or kind of rap stars behave. I'm going to sleep with a million women and have nice cars and just kind of live that kind of moment. Pure kind of hedonism. I don't know if they really, if there's somebody who's really seen himself in a kind of political or, I mean, Nazario Moreno was the Knights Templar who try and be like philosophical, and he had this kind of number two was a guy called La Tuta, who was a school teacher. And so he was a kind of more of the educated bad guy, and he had kind of saw themselves as being these kind of heroic. Sometimes they seem to spin heroic figures, like kind of they'll compare themselves to like Pancho Diaz, Zapata type figures. Seems kind of a rebellion, and if Pancho Villa was alive today, he probably would be some like major narco. To be fair, but like Yeah, I mean, they're kind of weird anti-heroes. And my second book, Gangster Waters, particularly looks at the kind of profile, these kind of weird anti-heroes, the kind of mix of CEOs of companies mixed with paramilitary leaders mixed with rock stars. It's kind of the kind of weird place they have in society. It's kind of that figure of Scarface. It's a kind of they're pretty crazy. They're pretty crazy figures of society. But I don't think they really. I mean, it was a weird discourse by this actress called Kate Castillo, who helped coordinate a meeting between Sean Penn and Chapo. And she played this role of a kind of drug trafficker and had this kind of long rant of like, oh, you need to traffic with love and I trust you more than the government. And this kind of idea that kind of drug traffickers could gain a consciousness and kind of be a solution, kind of sit down. And I wouldn't really put my hopes in that. Sometimes some of them can, some of them have got hearts and can show mercy and they are powerful people, but like that they can really going to kind of be some solution to this problem. I don't really see that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's such a difficult thing to look at because it's like being famous, but as you highlight, like an anti-hero where it's just, there's so few people that'll ever be in that situation. I mean, it's so hard to kind of wrap your head around even what's really even what it's like day to day. And, there's different ones where you have, El Chapo, as you were just highlighting, in Sinaloa, and then you'll have ones that are down south, up north, wherever it might be. So I think kind of understanding that cartel dynamic is really difficult. And you mentioned it earlier, and I'd love to kind of go into Fast and Furious and Wide Receiver. And one of the things you highlighted in the book, which I thought was really interesting, was that a lot of the failures there were our lack of understanding of the dynamics of the cartels. So maybe if you want to highlight, what those two areas were, Fast and Furious and Wide Receiver, and then, kind of highlight as well how the different dynamics of what the cartels are, their formulations is what really hurt us in those situations.
So Fast and Furious was an operation by the ATF carried out in Arizona, 2009 to 2010. Started to kind of blow open. You had a previous version also from Arizona called Wide Receiver back in the mid 2000s. Basically, these operations were with the idea of following gun traffickers and building conspiracy cases against gun trafficking organizations. So the same way they do about drug trafficking. Sometimes putting devices in the guns to trace them. Also just watching the guns be bought from stores in big numbers and taken to the cartels. With Fast and Furious, you had around 2,000 firearms being bought by these cartels, and they're just sitting there watching them. Eventually, some of the guns from Fast and Furious ended up in the hands of criminals who shot dead an elite Border Patrol agent, Brian Terry, in Arizona. Following his death, it kind of came out and it kind of blew open. I interviewed the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, about this. I I interviewed one of the confidential informants in Wide Receiver, and looked at this. I think really what you see in this is, first, this kind of shows the nature of these federal operations. I mean, when you get to the federal government operations, they're kind of pretty crazy about organized crime. It's kind of building conspiracy cases. And so you kind of see this stuff with, I mean, they do the same thing with drugs, but with drugs, you couldn't trace it in the same way. So you have people watching heroin be trafficked, watching fentanyl be trafficked, eventually try and bust these guys, but they're still kind of watching it happen. They did the same thing with guns. But also, in this case, they kind of misunderstood the cartel. It didn't make sense of the cartel. They kind of thought it was, the cartel works like some, like the US government, some kind of top-down organization. Where it's actually, very sophisticated cells without knowledge of each other, which are kind of financially independent and kind of changes all this kind of stuff. So they really didn't get off the base, and they were kind of basically, as they were following this operation, they were following these guys, and we've only got the bottom level guys. Well, let's just try and keep on following it. And then they've sold 1,000 guns. It's kind of looking kind of rather bad. No, we've got to keep on going. It's like 1,500 guns. Okay. And then eventually till it kind of blows up and okay, we've got to take it down these guys. So it's kind of like ineptness I see there. Now I do see there was politics involved in that, or the Obama White House, happened under the Obama White House. The Obama White House, like, let's hit gun trafficking. Felipe Calderon went to the US and said, like, let's hit gun trafficking. It was like, let's hit gun trafficking. So there's pressure like on trying to hit these guys, which ended up making a worse situation. And then I think that afterwards there was a lot of cover up. So where you do see more conspiratorial stuff is like after this was blown open, Eric Holder was like, oh, didn't know about this. Then they find out, well, that's just an email to you talking about this. Oh, I don't read my emails. And then this kind of stuff. So I think you see more conspiracy stuff with kind of covering. Everyone's like, oh, it wasn't me, it was him. Kind of covering up thing. But I don't believe, I mean, there was kind of a lot of conspiracy theories, or maybe a lot of conspiracy accusations. I know there is conspiratorial behavior sometimes, but kind of accusations of more organized corruption with this. One was saying, well, they did it to try and, because they're on an anti-gun platform. I don't think, if anything, this took the issue of firearms to Mexico off the agenda for a decade. Because it blew up in 2011. And then now we've come back to having, gun trafficking to Mexico back on the agenda a decade afterwards. For a decade, it was off the agenda. No one went near it. And maybe a couple of million guns went to Mexico. So I don't think it was really, it didn't do anything to help the kind of gun control cause or whatever. And then from Mexico, they're like, well, this was part of a conspiracy to destabilize Mexico or a conspiracy to help arm the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel got a lot of those guns. I think probably more ineptness than anything, and reflecting kind of deeper problems in federal operations.
Your conversation with Felipe Calderon was one of the most, like I said, my favorite parts of the book, and was shocking to say the least, just to hear, to say in pop culture, what we've seen, El Chapo, the TV show on Netflix, Narcos, different shows like that, they frame him in an interesting light. And a lot of times it almost seems like they're trying to frame him as he was at fault. He was, like I said, in the pocket of Sinaloa. Like there's like a lot of dynamics like that. But with your conversation, I think one of the more interesting dynamics is it seemed like that there was almost a disconnect with the US, and then also that there was a very hush-hush attitude towards Mexico addressing the gun problem. So do you want to speak on that a little bit, the conversation you had with Calderon, as well as maybe what are some of the aspects in that really surprised you, that maybe when you were going into that conversation you just didn't expect?
During the period, very intense on the ground. When I talked to him, it kind of, I interviewed him in a fairly, in an office in Mexico City, and he was quite open and forthcoming, and it kind of surprised me, an ex-president kind of on that way. Now, the way he was kind of quite open and didn't, it wasn't living in, you think if he'd just been like running, if it was the picture of Calderon as being the kind of Darth Vader figure, the kind of evil emperor figure who was just like making, $10 billion from all this. You think, why would he be in an office, kind of quite a local office in Mexico City talking about it? I mean, he might want to defend his reputation and his legacy, but, I'm not, I don't quite, I don't buy that really, that thing. Now, in terms of his corruption, when I interviewed him, it was, it was when there was accusations around, but it was before Garcia Luna had been taken. He already started distancing himself from Garcia Luna, who was basically his public security secretary, who was a very powerful figure in the administration, who's since been convicted of drug trafficking. So you think, well, if this guy was corrupt, how come Felipe Calderon didn't know? I think Felipe Calderon must have known some stuff, but I don't quite see him as a Darth Vader figure. I think he did have a concept, at least, of trying to reclaim the power of the Mexican state, and wasn't quite as deeply involved. Now I've got other, colleagues, journalists who are like, no, I do believe that like there was money going right into the presidential palace, and he was right in there in the kind of meetings involved in this. And I find that hard to see through. But either way, I think his military crackdown on drug cartels was a failure. I do think it was a failure either way. But a couple of things that strike me. One is this thing called the Merida Initiative, which is basically the U.S., a mechanism where the U.S. gave money to the Mexican military and Mexican government to fight the cartels. And some people will paint that as being, well, the U.S. kind of imposed this war on Mexico. But he said that wasn't true. He said Mexico went to the United States and said, oh, you guys are taking drugs. You've got responsibility. Give us some money. And this is the way Felipe Calderon said it. He said he was sitting down with George W. Bush. And he said to him, and George W. Bush was like, okay, what do you guys want? And Calderon said, you seen that TV show 24? He said, oh, yeah, I've seen that, yeah. All of those devices, I want that stuff. So it's kind of crazy when you get to the level of what these guys are doing. So that that was Mexico wanted all this kind of equipment. Now you could look at that cynically and they wanted that stuff to help them work with the cartels and stuff. It was just kind of, but anyway, it wasn't, the US didn't impose this on Mexico. Mexico did, or Calderon did kind of, and I do believe he had a concept that he would kick out the military. He would get some US money, and the cartels would calm down, and it kind of didn't work. The opposite happened, and he got deeper into the conflict. And then I do believe he knew about some of the corruption, but as well, it's what you say at times is at some points it's we'll just let the Sinaloa cartel run things because they let them take out the Zetas, because the Zetas are causing all these kind of problems. So we kind of got to side with them. So certain things he got put into that. He mentioned that towards the end of administration, and this is what he says, he was sitting around with his guys and was like, okay, think outside the box. What do we do? Shit's not working. And the guys start saying, should we legalize drugs? It's they were talking let's legalize them. And it was wow, that's so they were seriously discussing this at one point. It's just not, this shit's not working. Now, in terms of the Fast and Furious, he described how they, first of all, he said, this is the way he said it. He said that first of all, they started getting the Americans telling them, we've got an operation going on. It's going to be big. You're going to like this. So supposedly it'd be good for them. But then they started arresting some cartel figures, and they knew about. They're like, yeah, we were able to buy guns. They kind of knew. Some of the Mexican cartel figures kind of realized they were being allowed to be these guns to go through, which gets again a bit okay, is there something worse out here? But again, this could just be a netness. These guys realize they're not stopping us. We're taking these guns over the border. And then when it blew up, Felipe Calderon said that the Mexican government deliberately didn't kind of join in the attacks on the Obama administration because they saw the attacks coming very much from the NRA and stuff. The NRA kind of jumped on this this just proves our point. They're all in bed. They're arming cartels. This is kind of, so they were like, well, why would we support and join with the NRA attacking the Obama administration as well when he said that about that. But it's interesting his perspective. He's now in Spain, and he's now politically in big problems here. The people they want to see him in prison. They want to see Calderon in prison over. They see it as being he was in bed with the Sinaloa cartel, and Fast and Furious was proof of that, and it was all kind of added up to some big kind of plan. I think there might be a lot of kind of very dumb things being taking place, as well as there is some conspiratorial or very deep corruption as well.
So what do you think about when he went up and essentially brought up the issue that's happening with guns? It seems like, and I think you highlighted this well, where he, kind of approached the situation with a 6-foot pole, because when the NRA was jumping on it, he recognized that that's not exactly the alley he wanted to go down. And it seems like when presidents in Mexico, we're seeing this recently, quote unquote, go to battle with U.S. politicians, it ends up not being the best formula. We've seen this with, the Mexican president just recently. There was a lot of anger coming out from Republicans because he came out and essentially said, after Lindsey Graham was looking to label the group as a terrorist organization, the cartels, and it essentially was calling for looking for ways to mitigate Republicans in future elections, which, again, very controversial. What do you think about him having that choice to step up and speak about the issues of guns? And why do you think we're not seeing more politicians do that present from Mexico? Because, again, that could make a massive difference in making sure that people understand this isn't something that's only affecting here in the U.S. It's that it has, long tentacles that are really creating massive amounts of violence around the world.
When Felipe Calderon, he went to a joint session of Congress and he brought up firearms trafficking. He told me about that he was having this crackdown on cartels, and then they started seeing this is when this kind of escalation was happening, and they were seeing suddenly, their police were being outgunned, and you're suddenly seeing cartels with 100 guys with AR-15s and AK-47s, and they were buying them from the United States, and so suddenly realizing, like, how can we as a Mexican state fight this problem if they're being so heavily armed from the United States? And that's a continuing issue now. So I think he was justified in doing that, and some of the people saying, you're going to go to the joint session of Congress and you're going to attack them. But he, went in there and did that. Now that might have kind of helped, that kind of put political pressure. Then he had Fast and Furious, and then it kind of ended up getting knocked off the agenda. So it didn't work. They say in the end, Felipe Calderon's historical legacy was of failure. But I think, he was justified in doing that. If we look at the more recent issues now with Mexico, US, and it's tough on both sides. How do Mexico and the United States? I mean, we need cooperation. We need people coming together and trying to figure out damage limitation, reducing some of the damage on this. And it's hard, but they need to. Now, in terms of the kind of calling cartels terrorist groups, I don't, I'm not outraged by that. I don't think it's like I think there's ways you can see acts they do as terrorism. What I do think is that this is the idea, or what's being put by elements of some Republican figures right now, saying, we're going to bring in the military, we're going to cross over the border, we'll take these guys out. We've got the best military in the world, we can do this. It's a big, difficult, complicated situation. It's not that easy, right? You've got hundreds of thousands of people in these organizations and maybe millions of people involved in these organizations at secondary levels. Even if you cross over the border and kill 1,000 people, doesn't scratch them. You could get find out where the chapitos are and then go in there and we'll take those out. Which the military, they've been doing for like the last 20 years anyway, and it hasn't solved this. Just taking these guys out of military operations, which with the US agents there in some cases anyway, hasn't solved it. You get other guys pop up, and if the US does go over a border and and it does an operation and it also kills some civilians at the same time, that creates all kinds of issues. US gets pulled into a real swamp. So it kind of sounds good. It might sound good. I appreciate and sympathize with people saying these guys are seriously bad organizations. That's true. Mexico has been destabilized by these violent organizations. That's true. That the US should care about them spilling over? Yes. That fentanyl is a horrific problem that needs to be confronted? Yes. I agree with all of that. I think the Republicans are right to bring up this rhetoric, to bring up these problems and to say this is important and we need to take this stuff seriously. But look again deeper what the solutions to this, really what you want to do. Okay, you need US law enforcement cracking down hard on operations in the United States. You've got to confront the issue of drug addiction in the United States, a big priority, a big political priority. How do you deal with drug addiction, drug use in the US? You've got to stop guns going to these guys. Sure, you've got to work with Mexico on trying to help build up
police capacity and fight these things. But these are difficult problems that don't necessarily getting the best headlines. You kind of throw red meat to your base on both sides. People do this. And again, gets back to the kind of broken political system dealing with very, very challenging problems.
Well, Johan, I think that's honestly the best way to wrap it up today. Seriously, thank you for coming on. Blood Gun Money out everywhere. It's, like I said, a fantastic book. And honestly, I want to thank you too for the reporting that you're doing, all the multiple novels you release, journal entries, whatever you've done. Being able to follow you, being able to speak with you today, it's been a fantastic experience. And seriously, thank you for reporting on all this and really showcasing, like I've said many times, to people in America, what's actually happening south of the border, Latin America, and realistically around the world. So seriously, thank you. If you want to give a shout out to your social medias and let people know where they can find Blood Gun Money as well as your other books.
In the law and in the issue of gun trafficking. With my first book, El Narco, still a popular book there, and it's kind of wrote there, but a kind of bigger picture of Mexican drug cartels. And my second book, Gangster Warlords, which also chronicles organizations across the continent. You can see me website ioangrillo.com, Substack, Narco Politics, or look up Ioan Grillo. Twitter, Ioan Grillo. So all of my stuff, really, my name, IOANGRILLO. And yeah, it was a great conversation. It was, we went to some very interesting places, some very interesting insight, and we talked about some stuff, not the same kind of things, but really got some interesting perspectives on this, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to cover all bases. Like I said, reading your book, I was like, there are so many thoughts in here on ways that people haven't even looked at the issue. And also the way that you're able to present what's happening down south, like I said, is just, it's unique. You've been there. You've seen so many different things. And I think being able to have conversations like this is how we actually come to some of those solutions we were talking about. So seriously, thank you for coming on again. Hopefully we can get another show down the road. I'll make sure I read up on those two other books, and maybe we'll get a conversation on those as well.
Okay, yeah. So we've got shout out to all the aftermath followers, aftermath viewers. Good to step into your world there.